There's been growing calls for China to be held accountable for the coronavirus pandemic that has swept across the globe, causing thousands of deaths and economies to tumble. A few federal members have backed this call, including South Australian Senator Alex Antic, who believes Australia should be seeking compensation for the damage it's had on our economy. Joining me now is Alex Antic. Alex, thanks for joining us on Sky News Across Australia. Look, I think a lot of people sitting at home tonight would agree with you. How would we extract compensation from the Chinese on this?
Well, I think the question, and thanks for having me, Peter, I think the question of how is probably the more difficult of the questions. I think you perhaps start in this instance with the question of why. And really the answer to that is that we all know that this virus emanated in Wuhan in China. Chinese government have tried to tell the world otherwise, but that's quite mischievous. The reality here is that the virus, on best theory, seems to have emanated from these wet markets in China. China's got form in this regard, and we have to remember that we look back to 1997 with the avian flu, which is thought to have emanated in similar circumstances, but certainly in 2003, the SARS outbreak emanated in a very similar manner. So the issue really is, first of all, the issue of having the markets there potentially breeding these things in the first place, but then also the issue of the reaction after that and how they responded to it. So I think you start to get into troubled waters when you start talking about the how we do it. The world community came together after 2003, after the SARS outbreak, and formed some international law in the form of the International Health Regulations in 2005. They were designed specifically to cater for this sort of outbreak, and really they do put a positive obligation on individual states to report these sorts of things and to do it promptly to the World Health Organization and to the world community generally. It doesn't appear that China has done that in this instance, and I think that's where you begin with this story at this stage.
But Alex, you talk about the wet markets. The word on the street is, and there's certainly strong evidence that the wet markets are open again. How does that happen?
Look, it's absolutely baffling, Peter, and I saw that report. I've seen them over the last week, in fact. We're less than 3 months, really, from this outbreak beginning, and we're seeing reports now, credible reports too, by the way, that these wet markets are reopening, and particularly some in Wuhan. I find that absolutely unfathomable and intolerable, to be quite honest.
Well, I mean, I guess when we start to talk about how we deal with this going forward, surely one of the bilateral trade talks that we have with China will be along the lines of, you guys have got to show some social and ethical responsibilities and get rid of this. Even though it's been part of your culture for so long, it's very clear that we're headed for another pandemic at some point in the future if these things continue. I see today, Alex, where the first class action against China has been lodged in the federal court in the United States.
That's right. Look, there have been a couple of instances in the United States where people are already privately taking action. Now, look, they are very difficult things to do, and I'm certainly no expert in international law or United States law for that matter. But what we're talking about here is, I think you're quite right about the issue of diplomacy. It may well be that the world community gets together after this, and of course, we're not talking about any time soon because we're really not going to know what the overall damage bill will be. That won't crystallise probably for years, and we may never know the full outcry. But really, if the world community can get together, and we're talking about our Five Eyes nation partners, there is unity, strength in unity, I suppose, and things like bilateral, trilateral trade deals. There may be the issue of debt. There may be calls for, at some point, for that to be looked at. Who knows? I mean, the answer is, I think, the question needs to be put first. How did this happen? Why does it happen? And part of the issue of prosecuting this case potentially might well be just simply a disincentive for it happening again. I mean, whether or not you can ever expect comfortably to extract money out of the Chinese Communist Party is a very moot point. I think it's probably it's difficult, but people are right to be angry about this. And I think Australians increasingly are angry about what we've seen and the inaction in China. We're talking now, there is a report from the University of Southampton which says that if the Chinese Communist Party had acted 3 weeks earlier, we might have seen 95% less cases. look, that's something which can't be allowed to happen again.
Oh, that's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, just 14 days. What a difference 14 days would make. All right, before we head off, Alex, how do you think Australians are handling this particular crisis from a psychological viewpoint? Because the more we get into this, the more you hear stories of people, you know, the anxiety, you know, being self-quarantined, self-isolating. It is obviously having an impact, but as the Prime Minister repeatedly says, you know, he's paying a lot of credit to Australians for ostensibly, mostly, doing the right thing.
Yeah, look, I think that's quite right. You know, I think on the one hand, we've seen what is almost a sort of an unfortunate at best position from the authorities in China compared to the Australian response, which has really been one of coming together. We've heard that slogan time and time again of, you know, we're all in this together, and I think it's really true. I myself have been in self-isolation for more than a week now, having come back from Canberra. Of course, South Australia has handled this crisis very, very well, and we have border restrictions as well. But I mean, look, being stuck at home, you know, you might well think at first it's a great thing. It's not. I think all Australians are starting to find new ways to cope, and we're seeing all sorts of uniquely Australian things like, you know, cracking open a beer in front of a Zoom party and all that sort of stuff. I mean, there's got to be a silver lining to all of this. My great hope is that one of the great silver linings will be that there will be a little pushback into some of the stuff that makes Australia great, getting over some of this politically correct nonsense that we've had to endure for the last few decades. I think that's what we'll see out of this as well.
Yeah, great stuff. Alex Antic, thank you for joining us tonight on Sky News Across Australia.